Good morning, everybody, and let me say a warm welcome to you all. I want to thank all of you for being able to tune in this morning as we have the conversation around diplomatic engagement. And this one is not just about diplomatic engagement, but actually strategic diplomatic engagement, because we think that as activists, as individuals, we actually practice diplomacy on a daily basis. And as we deal with people, we think about how we talk with them, how sensitive are we to their needs, their actions, the surroundings, politically, socially, economically. And some of these, as we continue our work as activists, we see how important it is, especially with connecting with persons in positions such as diplomats, as governments, as anyone we perceive to be in a position of power, really and truly. And so this morning, it's really overwhelming for me as the executive director of the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, to really be able to have had the honor to work with Jaevion Nelson of Jamaica to really look at what was required of an individual to start thinking around diplomatic engagement, especially for those who haven't. And for those who have, how could we have helped them to actually think through how they can improve what they are doing already? And so this morning, the panelists that we have really is going to take us through a wonderful learning experience, because they are going to be sharing their experience with us. Whether they have been in diplomatic positions, they are in diplomatic positions, or how they actually engage that. So from ECADE, I am Kenita Placid. Welcome you all. Second page, as we move forward, is to really hand over to the young man that I actually admire, who have done so much from youth engagement to LGBT engagement to human rights, who we call Mr. Diplomacy himself. And I'm not gonna go all into the long, I felt like he didn't give me his academics. So I am sticking with, I'm not going into the bio that he gave me, but I will allow him to introduce himself to you. Your moderator for today, Jaevion Nelson.
All right, thank you, Kenita, and thank you to the ECADE team for inviting me. It has been a pleasure working with the human rights defenders from across the Eastern Caribbean on, diplomatic engagement and how we can use that to bolster human rights advocacy right across the Caribbean and not just in the Eastern Caribbean region. So it is a pleasure to be with you all today, and I hope this will be a very fruitful and productive forum for all of us to better understand some of the nuances and the ins and outs and how we work around diplomacy and work with people who are working in such spaces. I am Jaevion Nelson. I'm a human rights defender from Jamaica. I focus on human rights and social justice and inclusive development. And today, to help us have that conversation, we have Steve McCready, who is the resident British High Commissioner in St. Lucia, and he has been working with the UK government for 11 years and has served in a number of positions, including assignments to Tokyo and Anguilla. We have Randy Boissonnault, who is the former Canadian politician. And in 2016, Randy was named Special Advisor on LGBTQ2 issues to the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And we have Lysanne Charles, who is the chair of the Board of Directors of ECADE. And last but not least, we have Rhyesa Joseph, who is a St. Lucian, and she is a board member of the Monsignor Patrick Anthony Folk Research Center, a teacher, and a political science consultant. So what we're going to be doing today, as I said, we have been having conversations of the past 3 days with advocates from across the region about diplomacy and how we can work together and how we can engage people who are diplomats and others who are advocates working around diplomatic spaces to really bolster the advocacy and activism we do for women and girls, young people, LGBTQ people, people living with HIV and other vulnerable and marginalized citizens in our country. And so, to kick things off, I'm going to ask each of my very lovely panelists who have so kindly agreed to join us today to give us about 2 to 3 minutes of introduction, just talking to us about their work and how they have found diplomacy in the last couple of years that they've been doing it. What it is like representing their country and a bit about their roles and responsibility. So let's start with you, Steve.
Good morning, Jaevion. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for having me here today. I was really excited when the opportunity arose. So I'm delighted to be here. And I'm very interested to sort of pick up on what you've been learning over the last couple of days. I have to say, I love your name, Mr. Diplomacy. I think that's a cracker. My name, as you've heard, is Steve McCready. I'm the resident British Commissioner here in Castries in St. Lucia. I've been here just over 4 years now. And prior to that, I spent 4.5 years, as Jaevion already said, in Anguilla, working as the Chief of Staff to Anguilla. So I've spent almost a decade in the Caribbean now, and it's been a wonderful decade, one I wouldn't change for anything. My role here as the resident British Commissioner in Castries, it's really a representative role for the British government. So I represent the British government in terms of the bilateral relationship with St. Lucia. And as I'm sure you've covered in the past couple of days, that can cover a whole range of things. It can cover the political bilateral aspects of the relationship. How do we feel about various international relations issues? But aside from that, it covers what we would call thematic issues. So to give you one of the biggest examples this year for the British government, that would include climate change, for example, because the UK is hosting the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November this year. Another thematic issue would be human rights, of course, and that is where I feel very privileged to have worked with CNITA and ECADE and some of the other civil organisation groups in the Caribbean on equality issues, human rights issues. That's something which the British government has a very clear policy on. But I suspect what we'll come on to talk about a bit is how do you actually deliver that policy, which is much more difficult than just having the policy. The only thing I would say just in conclusion is I think this is a great event for me. I think I'm going to learn a lot because I think diplomacy and foreign policy maybe 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, it was all about government to government or predominantly about government to government. And I think there's now a much more enhanced realization, both in practical terms, by diplomats, by academics, that actually it's much wider than that now. It's not just government to government. It's about engaging with civil groups. It's about engaging with the media. So it encompasses, the role of diplomacy encompasses many more things and more strands of work than it might have done when I started the Foreign Office. I correct you there slightly, Jaevion. I've actually been in the Foreign Office for 20 years, so I'm getting on a bit. So with that, I'll say thanks again for having me here. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing what the session unfolds. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was very, very beautiful, very appreciative. And then we have Randy. And the beautiful thing about Randy is that Randy has not just worked in diplomatic spaces or around diplomatic spaces, but he's also an advocate. And there's a beautiful TED Talk, if you've not seen it as yet, where he talks about how you move from being an ally to a champion for LGBT rights. So Randy, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Jaevion. I'm not surprised you've done your homework. You're known for that. That's part of what it means to be Mr. Diplomat or Mr. Diplomacy, is you do your homework first. I want to thank Kenita for the invitation to come and speak with you all at ECADE. I mean, look, let's talk about Kenita for a minute. She is the woman who shall be obeyed. And when she asks, you just say yes. And so I'm here because she asked. And I see you all clicking and saying, yes, we know what you're talking about. But look, that's a key element in being a good diplomat. You have to be relentless. You have to be persistent. You have to know what you want, and you have to know who can help you get what you want. And I think always keeping that in mind, what is it that you're trying to do? How can you align your interests with the people you're trying to, interact with? And if you always keep that in mind and play to your strengths, I think you'll see some success in your way. My name is Randy Boissonnault. I'm a former member of Parliament, former special advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau on LGBTQ2 issues. I'm currently the co-founder and vice chair of the Global Equality Caucus. And at some point in this event, I'm going to put a little plug in for our event coming up for North America and the Caribbean in the Lawmakers for LGBT plus Equality series. Kenita is part of that, as are some other great speakers from the region. March 31st, 7 p.m. Eastern time. We'd love you to join us because it is about advocacy and it's about understanding what's going on in our world. I didn't win the 2019 election, but I can tell you there's life after politics. And what's been beautiful for me is spending more time with my partner, David, and we're actually coming to you from Belfast today. So I want to say good afternoon from Belfast, just by Queen's University. And I just want to say that I love the advocacy. I love the people who are on this. I love the fact that you're doing this training. I think there are some techniques that certainly Steve can share with you. I mean, I fell into diplomacy. I didn't do the Foreign Service exam. I got asked by the Prime Minister to do this work. And for me, diplomacy is really about making sure that you're clear in what you're advocating for, that you align with the values of the people that you're trying to work with. And in the questions, I can certainly share with you the mandate that Canada's embassies and high commissions have about working with and for LGBTQ2 communities wherever they are in the world. We just recently launched the Active Fund, which we can talk about as well. And there are pockets of funding available. So if any of your groups have yet to reach out to the Canadian presence in your city or in your country or in your region, please do, and I'm happy to make that connection. So let's just pause there.
Thank you, Randy. And then we go to Lysanne. And as I said, Lysanne is the chair of ECADE. And Lysanne, perhaps you can share with us from an advocate's perspective around your experiences and engaging, and tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm a bit tired because actually I'm just off of campaigning for the second chamber in the Netherlands. And thankfully, our party won one seat, so we're now actually a part of the second chamber, Bay 8. It's a very small party, so it was a lot of intense campaigning. But I'm very, very happy to be here nonetheless. My name is Lysanne Charles. I'm the current chair of ECADE and also the outgoing chair of St. Martin's and Martin Alliance for Equality. For me, in my capacity in those two roles, I would say that diplomacy and advocacy has really been about bridge building. Sorry, you might hear me stumbling a good bit today because I am a little bit tired, but so please excuse that. But it is about bridge building. I think indeed someone said before me that it's about finding out what the needs of your communities are and also trying to serve those needs. And I think for me, it's been about trying to connect different communities to each other because I even recently, I've had a conversation around having to put aside one side of myself and maybe advocate for another side of myself first. And for me, that is quite impossible. I said, I cannot separate my womanness, my Caribbeanness from my gayness, from my, so for me, it's very impossible to say, okay, let's only look at one issue first and then look at other issues. I think if we really speak to the liberation of a person or liberation and empowerment of people, then you have to look at who they all are, the whole of who they are. And so for me, it's really been about bridge building, connecting groups across issues and figuring out how you can connect them on the issues where they meet and where they don't meet, say like, okay, let's just put a pause on those. And also I wanted to say, for me, diplomacy has also been about evolution because people you have to meet people where they are and also understand that maybe the way that you look at things now are not how other people look at things. So you have to make space for that and make space for the conversation. And I have to say for myself, it also took a long time. So if I even look at how I approached feminism when I was younger, so like 20 years ago, I was much more like, like go get it, beat people up a bit. And now I'm much more like, okay, no, I understand where I'm at. I have to understand a little where other people are at and where we meet and connect. That's where we can do work. So for me, I think it's quite important that as we continue as ECADE, and also as Safe SXM, that we continue to build those bridges and connect the various communities together and do the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Lysanne, and congratulations. We know politics is good hard work. And then last but not least, let's go with Rhyesa. As an advocate, give us your own perspective. And I think you come from a very intriguing background, being an educator. And I think that will help us to better understand from another perspective as well.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you once again for inviting me to this forum. And congratulations to Lysanne as well on that milestone achievement. I hope that it allows you to create space for those persons that you represent and to bring forth new views and perspectives. Well, my perspective, as you would have highlighted, Jaevion, is very interesting because I am new to the teaching profession officially. I've been an educator for 2 years. And in addition to that, I also serve in various capacities. First, as a board member in the Folk Research Center in St. Lucia, which deals with advocating for the preservation of cultural heritage in St. Lucia, folklore, folk culture, folk traditions, and those persons and spaces that occupy that role in an environment where very often when something cannot be monetized, we do not see the value inherent within it, and the thrust is towards destruction rather than preservation. So from that perspective, we come to realize that fighting for equity often deals with making space so that everyone can live full lives. And that is the vantage point I want to come from in discussing diplomacy, about how we are able to improve quality of life, standards of living, creating space through education and value for each other. Because very often, because persons cannot relate or cannot empathize with being in a position, it's very difficult for them to see value in the worth of other people. So from that perspective, from cultural heritage standpoint, from language preservation, we have an indigenous language in St. Lucia referred to as Creole. And very often, Creole speakers are not considered when we look at policy inclusion, communication, and they are left out. And that is a crucial part of diplomacy, speaking for those who cannot speak for themselves, who do not have the platform or perhaps do not believe that they have the power to do what they can. On another front, I also am the founder of a consultancy recently started, From Classroom to Community, that seeks to really speak about Caribbean ideas and how Caribbean ideas can be used to formulate and create a society, a civilization where Caribbean people can find worth and value and be recognized in the spaces we are in. While we might believe that equity is something that all of us are interested in, our unique histories impact our vantage points and what we come from and how we experience inequality. For example, in the Caribbean, when we speak about injustice, we can look at it from a myriad of perspectives of economic injustice, of racial injustice, of gender-based discrimination for us, particularly from those countries that now want to speak to our own condition of inequality. And they have been a part of creating the foundations for the inequality in our own region. So these are the various platforms that I believe I can contribute to in this discussion, and I look forward to learning from our panelists as well as our participants as well. Thank you again for having me. And let me just apologize to our viewers who are wondering, why can't I see her face? I would have explained to Kent Taylor that there are some technical difficulties happening in my community. So I'm actually speaking today to you from my phone. I just wanted to share an image of myself in the event that anybody wanted to see, who is this person speaking in front of me? This is me, an image of me, so that they can put a face to the voice. Thank you again.
Thank you, Rhyesa. And what a beautiful image it is. And, I think you really summed it up and brought it home towards the end for us as the last panelist to really give us opening remarks. When we're doing diplomacy, when we're doing advocacy, it really is about representing people and ensuring that we look at all the intersections of people who we are advocating for, because intersectionality is so very critical to the work that we do to ensure that the voices of people are heard everywhere and in every spaces, and that they are represented effectively for meaningful change. And I think, I really like when Lysanne shared that when we're doing diplomacy, it's really about bridge building. And, I think all the speakers really spoke to that it's about how do we connect people, how do we connect with each other to really advance the goals that we have. And that while we all have our own interest, as Randy said, the important thing is that we are persistent and that we are resilient and that we are aware of who can really help us to get there, And so to kick things off, we're going to have a couple questions, but I don't want to be asking all the questions. So I implore you all who are tuned in, if you have questions, whether on Facebook or here on the Zoom platform, please share your questions and we'll ask them as we go along. But to start things off, perhaps Randy and Steve, you can share with us a little bit about what you think is the most important thing human rights defenders should know when engaging diplomats or people who work in such spaces.
I'll give that a go. I think you need to understand the context that the people that you're engaging with are operating in. If they're government representatives, all governments have a foreign policy orientation, if you will, some guiding principles. And I always found it interesting to make sure that I understood what the guiding principles of the Foreign Office and the government as a whole were before we went into any diplomatic spaces. And that also is consistent when you're dealing with the Commonwealth, when you're dealing with the United Nations, or the European Union. Any big body is going to have a general set of principles and orientation. It's important that you understand that. And then the flip side of that is you should understand what it is that you want in the long term. What are you trying to achieve? And I also think the thing that was really helpful when we were trying to make progress was understanding the next incremental step that you need the person to do that you're meeting with. And if you can make it very simple for them and you can be flexible in what that looks like, I think you can anticipate some success. I'll give you an example. I was just speaking yesterday with a young Indian Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, Anish Gawande, and he went and talked to some officials in India because he wanted to set up an LGBT crisis line. And if he'd approached it from an LGBT crisis line, it would have been a flat no. But the way he presented it was, I need this crisis line in 3 languages because it's only in English right now. And we need this crisis line because we have too many young people who are dying of suicide. And what resonated with the policymakers wasn't the LGBT part, it was the fact that he wanted the line in 2 of the national languages other than English, and that people were dying, and that this party wants to see as many people, young people, make it to adulthood as possible. So the reasons they did it weren't necessarily directed in the way that this particular activist wanted, but the results were exactly what they wanted.
Steve?
Thank you. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. That would have been everything Randy's just said would certainly have been included in my answer, so I won't repeat it. I think when I think about sort of how diplomats work, there's sort of 3 R's which I think about. One, it's always about the relationships. And as Rhyesa just said, that's focusing on people. This is a people business. And people are different and interesting, and they have moods. And so good diplomacy always reflects and is able to adapt and be nimble to that, I think. As Randy said, second R would be representation. So when you're looking at me as a representative of the British government, I don't have leeway, obviously, to make British government policy. I am translating the policy which is defined by ministers. And just to follow on from what Randy said, when you're engaging diplomats as as trying to get something, the more you know about what the policy is, then the next question can be, how much wiggle room does Steve, as the diplomat, or whoever I'm engaging with, how much wiggle room do they have to give me what I want without it turning into a real nightmare for them, i.e. having to write submissions to ministers in London in my case. So I think that's always a good question to ask. Am I being realistic about what I'm asking? And then the third R is about results. And that's really about how getting what you want. There's a great quote. It comes from an Italian diplomat. It's been used by many diplomats I've come across in my service. And that is that diplomacy is the art of letting someone else have your way. That's a quote by Daniel Vara in the early 20th century. And I think that encapsulates an awful lot about what good diplomacy is. So when you're engaging with diplomats, again, I think, as Randy said, you know what your sort of top objective is, and we all know we're looking at equality in the Caribbean region and beyond for everyone. So we know what that is, but then you have to work down from there. And eventually, when you get to the point about implementation, you have to ask about what's going to be effective. So I know what the British government policy is in the Caribbean. If I thought it was going to be effective, if it was as simple as once a month I would go on television in St. Lucia and say that the British government wants the government of St. Lucia to treat everyone equally, and if I did that for, let's say, 3 years and that was going to be effective, bingo, I'm sure I could get sign-off from London to do that. But of course, it's not as simple as that, and there are so many different things at play. There are, some of the decision makers that you're dealing with, they will have genuine political problems, which will not just enable them just to click a finger and affect the policy you want. So the last thing I would just say, when you're engaging, whether it's diplomats like myself or politicians like my colleagues on the panel or whoever it is, you have to think about what's going to be most effective. Sometimes that will mean you are sensitive. Sometimes it'll mean that you're tactful. Sometimes it might mean you have to be blunt. Sometimes you might want to get someone else to do the talking for you. Sometimes you might just want to be silent. So every engagement is different, is the thing I would say. So when you're using the art of diplomacy, you need to calibrate that and judge it for what's going to be most effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve and Randy. And before I go to Lysanne and to Rhyesa, I wanted to follow up on which I think is an important question, since both of you actually touched on foreign policy and the importance of foreign policy. And when we had the training over the last 3 days, we actually spoke about foreign policy and why foreign policy is so important. So maybe both of you can share a little bit about, why is foreign policy important, and importantly, why should advocates also be aware of what another government's foreign policy is on the human rights issues they are concerned about, and what are some of the ways in which we can, for more small island developing states like St. Lucia, Anguilla, Jamaica, Barbados, work to ensure that foreign policies from maybe the Canadian government or the UK government are reflective of some of the things that we're concerned about.
I'll follow Steve this time.
Okay, thanks, Randy. So I think when we're talking about foreign policy, I'd sort of go back a little bit to what I said in the introduction, that foreign policy is viewed differently, and I think quite rightly so, than it was a long time ago. Those of you who follow the UK will have seen this week that the British government released its integrated review. So, a big step back and a big look at what is the UK's foreign policy for the next decade. And I advise anyone on the call to take a look at that, because it'll be really interesting given your course. It's very interesting because of the structure of it, and it starts off in the first 2 pages with our Prime Minister's vision. So it gives you the big picture, where he wants the UK to be by 2030. And then as you work through the document, it's about, okay, so as Randy said earlier, what are our foreign policy principles that we are going to, what are our principles that we are going to base our foreign policy on? And then as you get further down, it works, it delves into various issues. There's been quite a lot of talk about what the integrated review has said about the UK's nuclear capability, for example. The big point I think about foreign policy for advocacy is, in the 21st century today, it is merged with domestic policy so tightly that you cannot separate the two. So when you are trying to make progress on the issue which you are working on, knowing the foreign policy, knowing how that merges with the domestic policy will mean you're better prepared and better armed to be more effective, I think. Thank you.
All right, Randy. Okay, I don't know. Randy, are you hearing us? I think we're having a little trouble with Randy, so maybe we can move on and then come back to him. Okay.
It was a temporary pause in the unmuting. So we're back. Look, I just want to say quickly, and I can see why. I mean, we're getting a little bit of spam. It happens when you do these things. The foreign policy of a country is its external face to the world, and it's a projection of values to the world. And the best foreign policies and those expressions of values are then backed up by policies and by money. And so those of you who are in the British orbit, whether it's through the Commonwealth Equality Network or other international venues, now's your time to get involved in helping the UK redesign its foreign policy for the next 10 years. I mean, everything from the military to foreign aid to how it projects LGBTQ values around the world is going to be part of this conversation. And so now's the time to really activate your networks and be part of that. We went through this in Canada the first 2 years of my time in government, and then we launched the Feminist Development Assistance Program. And that's where these pockets of money, like $25,000 for organizations at the embassy and high commission level, were able to be activated because civil society activists got involved. So it's really important. And I see Juran asked us a question, Juran Bowen asked us a question. Send a letter, send a note, send an email to a high commissioner, to a diplomat, to anybody that you have a contact with. In many cases, organizations get to the point where they get funded, not because they made a first contact with an ambassador or high commissioner, but with a staff person at the local embassy or at the high commission. And you got to remember, like, the Steves of the world are really important. So are the people around Steve, the staff and the people that support what gets put in front of him. Because if it doesn't get put in front of him, he doesn't know about it. And so make sure that you're working all the relationships in the diplomatic ecosystem that you want to affect.
All right. Thank you, Randy. That was beautiful. I do agree. Yeah. And I think sometimes we oftentimes forget about all the people who actually influence the people who sometimes sign off on the decisions. And I think it's just the same for political activism. You know, we oftentimes try to reach the minister of our governments, and that's oftentimes very, very difficult. But there are so many people around them who sometimes are the people who say this is what you should do and should not do. And we oftentimes ignore them. And I think it's always important to, as you say, look at the entire ecosystem in the diplomatic circle or diplomatic ecosystem and reach to those individuals. So for Lysanne and Rhyesa, I'd love to hear from you. What has been your experience working with diplomats, engaging with diplomats, and what kind of advice do you have for advocates who are interested in reaching individuals and perhaps help us understand, give some advice based on what Juran asked, about how smaller advocates can solicit the support of people from diplomatic missions without the backing of an organization.
Yes. So first of all, I would like to say that I think you have to really know, and I think this has been said earlier as well, know who you're going to speak to, know what their aims are, their purpose, what their vision is for the coming years, and also where the vision and goals of your organization aligns with those, so that you can actually have conversations around where you actually meet, where your interests meet, and also where you can have results that speak to the interests of both your organization. I think part of diplomacy is indeed doing that, doing your homework, making sure you have the correct information, making sure you understand what the persons or the organizations, the governments would like as well. And then what I thought was very important, is what Randy just said, which is that, foreign policy is the face of the country, so to speak, to the world. So one of the things that I would say is, for me as the chair of SAFE SXM, it's been very interesting engaging with government officials, both on St. Martin and in the Netherlands, around this issue of funding, LGBT empowerment and whatnot, because actually it's quite difficult to get funds on St. Martin, because St. Martin is a part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And because of that, usually we cannot access funding from other global north organizations, but it's also difficult for us to access funding from the Netherlands itself, because they said, no, this is something actually your government should fund. So in those conversations, even understanding that the Netherlands actually positions itself as the champion of human rights defense, for the world, has helped us to have those conversations. Like, okay, but listen, you're doing this for other countries, and yet within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, there is a gap, there's a deficit in what you're willing to contribute towards our goals, which are also your goals. And you can also have like hard conversations then around what is missing, and also keeping your own governments or your own government officials accountable, but also saying this is where we can work together, this is what our needs are, and this is what you said that you're willing to fund. So for me, it's also really about knowing who you're speaking to, understanding where you meet, also prioritizing your goals, because as a small organization, we may want to do everything, and understanding that you will not get funding to do everything. So again, see where you can get the funding, where your goals meet with other funders' goals, and then work on those areas, and also understand that you're not giving up on the other goals that you have, but you're just prioritizing them accordingly. And so for me, I think that's where I would start. And also to answer the question of Juran, am I saying it correct? It is also indeed about sending lots and lots and lots and lots of letters, attending sessions like these, making contacts. For me also, sometimes it could be as simple as reaching out to somebody on a social media platform, just saying, hey, can we have a conversation? And then you get responses, having those conversations. And I know sometimes it can be tough, if you're not from a well-known organization, it can be tough sort of getting attention to yourself. But also I think if you're doing the work on the ground, that you can actually also speak about and show that you're really already working. A lot of organizations are open to speaking with you and meeting with you, and networking is critical. So if you're in the region, also network with larger organizations and see where, again, your points come together, and where you differ, then you leave those aside.
Thank you for that, Lysanne. Some of the points I'll bring up are kind of connected to what our previous speakers were talking about when they were discussing foreign policy. Awareness is important also at the national level, as would have been emphasized by previous panelists, because you can't really go in and engage strategically if you don't know what the context is, what your advantages and possible disadvantages as well. So it's important to know your platform, know the society in which you are operating from, why they think what they think, because very often people are not necessarily, how would I say, against certain platforms or movement, but they lack critical education to understand it. So a lot of the views people hold are from a platform of ignorance. But if they knew better, I like to operate from that point of view. If they knew better, a lot of them would consider alternatives or rethink some of the things that they have been taught or socialized into certain values. Because as adults, we would have realized some things that we learned when we were children right now don't seem that logical or fair or just or equitable. So that's one position. We always have to be aware of where we are, who we are, and who we are engaging with. Allyship is also critical. And we want to be allies with people, not just because we want them to assist, but we too are learning from them in their own platforms of advocacy. So I may be advocating from a perspective of good governance and cultural empowerment, but I can also learn something from the environmental community because they may have similar challenges and want to petition similar individuals in power structures. So I can learn from how they have sought to perhaps usurp some structures that have stopped them from doing what they've been trying to do. And I come back to education as well. Whether you are an individual who is just starting out, educate whatever audience you are speaking with. And don't just educate them by sharing information on a one-off basis. Do it consistently. Amplify your voice, because what you're really trying to do is to build a consciousness around a particular issue. And it's not going to happen in one day. It might require that you talk about an issue consistently and connect it to things that perhaps are of value to them. So I think an example was given earlier on about the policy that sought to mitigate the rise in suicide among LGBTQ youth. But what was the sticking point was on the use of language. Where are the areas of commonality where we can see, where we can meet each other and then grow from there? I also think it's important to do an asset mapping of what you have available in your society. And our idea of power is generally the belief that it rests solely in the hands of government. But there is a lot of power available within civil society networks, and knowing who your gatekeepers are, your people of influence that are outside of representative positions, because these are the constituents of the politicians and the policymakers. So if the constituents become concerned and engaged about it, they too will assist you in pushing forward whatever issue you are trying to raise awareness for. So take, for example, let's say you have a policy that may impact LGBTQ in terms of education. And we know parents care about their children and how they learn, how they qualify. If we tie it into the well-being of children, then you're going to have more than just individuals who are interested in LGBTQ rights, but those who are interested in child welfare and security and education advocates who can see, well, I never thought of it from this perspective, but I now see where you are coming from. So for me, a lot of it is grounded in awareness, allyship, education, using your voice, but also doing so consistently, because we're trying to build consciousness. And we know that the space in advocacy is not a sprint, it's a marathon of building relationships, opening doors, and allowing people to relearn things that they would have previously been opposed to.
Thank you, Rhyesa. I think those were some really, really good recommendations. I think that's real sage advice for all of us in engaging diplomats, and even just in just working around or advocates in activism, whether we are targeting political representatives or people who are career diplomats. I want to come to an area of contention that oftentimes come up when as advocates, we engage people in diplomatic spaces. But before I get to all of that, I want to ask a question around, young people. So Randy, perhaps you can tell us if there's space in foreign relations or international relations for young people. And then Randy and Lysanne, sorry. And then I'd love to hear from Steve, having been involved in foreign service for so very long. If you can give us some advice on how one becomes a diplomat, because I know Duran, for example, who was a part of the training and is studying international relations, is very interested in getting into foreign service for his country.
There we go. Look, there are entire political science departments and foreign relation sections of universities around the world. And so that tells you that there's a place for youth to be involved, because they're studying the theory, and the way to get the practice is to seek out, I know that in the Canadian government, there are internships, there are opportunities to be connected with the government of the day. And I also think that if you're studying foreign relations or foreign service and you want to understand how your government engages with diplomacy, activism is a very good way to actually put the theory to practice. And so I think there are ways, and there definitely could be more ways for youth to be involved, but definitely seeking out internships in your country. I mean, simply connecting with your member of parliament or your congressperson or the person that represents you at the state or provincial level, if you're in a federated country, is a way to engage in the political process and letting them know of your interests in the diplomatic sphere.
All right.
Yes. Yeah. So I think very similar to what Randy said, there's definitely room for youth in diplomacy and in advocacy. I think in addition to the educational institutions, you also have a lot of youth councils on the various Caribbean islands. I know you also have youth chapters of your various political parties that you can learn a lot from. Also, youth chapters of LGBT and women's rights organizations, etc. So I think all of those are good ways for young people to get involved with issues and also with understanding how relationships work between different stakeholders and whatnot. And I think for those who are like super serious about it and want to do it as a career, indeed, connecting with seasoned diplomats on your islands or in your country and getting some mentorship from them is also a good way to go and to start. But I also think it's up to us to keep creating space for young people, because not all young people are as assertive or empowered to do it, even though they have great ideas, they have, good knowledge and whatnot. So I think it's also up to us to continue to create more space, to continue to provide more funding for opportunities for them to be involved and yeah, just being open and allowing them to also have room in our processes. So for me, I think, yeah, definitely to answer the question, there is space and there's need, there's need for more space for young people.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lysanne.
I think you asked me about how one would go about sort of getting a career in the Foreign Service. I mean, of course, it's different for every country. 2 decades ago when I started, it's probably fair to say, what you would call factory floor level. So I didn't go straight into sort of policy work. It was what we called first of all administrative, and then an operational level, and then sort of eventually I worked my way up. So I don't have academic qualifications as much as is expected certainly today for someone seeking to join the British Foreign Service. And of course every island will have a different sort of entry procedure. But I think what I would say is I'd encourage what the two speakers said before, that the more you can find ways to engage, before you're taking the step of sending in an application form, the more legitimate and credible that you will be. And the very fact that you're doing a course like this, for example, it says an awful lot about your mindset. The one thing I would say is don't be afraid of it. And we were talking at the start about people, and I think quite often there's, the title of this session itself and how to engage with diplomats is quite interesting. Diplomats are just people too. You know, at the end of the day, I finish my work and I fight with my wife and I go and play with the dog in the garden and we have dinner. So when you're engaging with diplomats or when you're thinking about a career in the diplomatic service, and this is something I'm very passionate about, as Randy knows, because we were talking about it before, I come from Northern Ireland, which is considered a sort of small regional part of the UK. There's only a small percentage of diplomats in the British Foreign Service are from Northern Ireland. But I've always felt very sort of keen to make sure that I do diplomacy in my way. I don't adjust my personality because I think it should be done in an English way or in a Scottish way or in a way that someone who went to private school did, for example, which I didn't. So the point is, authenticity always rings true in no matter what you're doing. And that's true for diplomacy as much as everything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, very, very good. So now to go to the point of contention, which I think quite often comes up in with advocates and diplomats. So, you know, in our training for the last 3 days, one of the things that we mentioned, for example, I think it was David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, he had made a statement about, you know, considering withholding aid from some countries who do not take action on LGBT rights. And I think, or there are times when the foreign policy of one country and what is expected of the diplomat engaging advocates in the country does not necessarily match the priorities of the community on the ground, whether it's for women's rights or youth issues or children's rights or LGBT issues. And so I'd love to hear from all of our speakers, you know, how you think advocates and diplomats can kind of navigate those differences in priorities to really come back to what we spoke about earlier, that common ground in reaching a consensus and really getting what we want. Maybe we start with you, Steve, since you're number one on my screen.
Gosh, I was hoping you'd go to everyone else first. Yeah, on for that one. Yeah, we're getting into the serious stuff now, I guess. There's no right or wrong answer with diplomacy. Again, this is a people business, and this isn't science where you mix a few chemicals together and you get a known result. And because of that, the procedure which goes into making foreign policy and then about how to implement that foreign policy, there can be lots of different avenues to go down it. I think I would call what you were talking about with David Cameron in particular. And I'll not sort of go into the wisdom or wrongs of that, although I'm delighted if other people sort of want to go into that sort of approach. But what I would say is sometimes that sort of diplomacy can be effective, whereby you're saying, well, hang on a minute, this is really important to me. So because this is really important to me, unless you do what I want, this thing which is really important to you, it's going to be affected too. Now that can be a good way to go about things, but I would say this is me sort of, if I can for a second, not speaking officially on behalf of the British government, this is my personal perspective. I would say 9 times out of 10 or 95 times out of 100, if you're getting to that stage, the likelihood is you're in a bit of trouble. And that sort of approach very often tends to make things worse, rather than better. And you get into a sort of tit for tat situation and when that's on a national level, that can actually be very damaging to people's lives. So again, going back to what I said about being effective and on LGBTQ issues in the Caribbean or on human rights equalities issues in the Caribbean, what I've tried to do in my time here, especially, and working with Kenita and with others, has been to say, okay, you tell me what you want me to do, and hopefully I can play a complementary role. So, I've been in the Caribbean 10 years. For a British diplomat, I'm probably relatively good on how the Caribbean works. But in comparison to Kenita and the vast majority of people on this call, I'll be relatively very, very poor in knowing how best to progress issues. So it's very important to listen to the people who really know what's going to make the difference. And then again, hopefully what I can do is complementary. So while Kenita's doing her thing and other groups are doing their things, and if I'm listening to them, I can be having conversations here, there, perhaps behind closed doors, which can be helping us all get to the ultimate objective.
All right, thank you, Steve. And I know Randy has to run very, very soon. So I'm going to allow Randy to go, and maybe if people have 1 or 2 questions for Randy, you can also just send it in the chat, and we'll have Randy answer it before he pops out. And Randy, perhaps you can also just give us a bit of information on the active fund that was just recently launched.
Okay, no pressure. So let's go in reverse order. The active fund is I want to say 10 million. Don't hold me to that. We had a $30 million over 5 years and 10 million a year ongoing, and at least 10 million of that has gone into the active fund. So Canadian-based LGBTQ2 organizations that are doing work in the rest of the world will be able to apply to this fund. So if you're looking to do work in your region and you know of or want to connect with a Canadian organization that you've already worked with or that you were thinking of working with, now's the time because the calls are open. So Canada can connect you with Dignity Network. Those of you who work in the French Caribbean can connect with ECADE. There's our Rainbow Railroad, for example, is also looking at doing work in this fund. So now's the time to really connect with Canadian organizations. We took our cue from the Dutch. So to Lysanne's point, I mean, the Dutch had done work overseas internationally for so many years, and we just never did it. And so I went to bat and I pushed, and we got $30 million out of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So that's that. On this other question about controversial topics, I think that you have to be prepared to speak truth to power. And you have to be able to tell a national government when they're at risk of doing more harm than good. And it's certainly what NGOs told Canada under the last administration when a minister went guns blazing essentially into Uganda, berating the government for not doing enough on LGBT issues. And then civil society in Uganda got back to the government and said, you're actually doing more harm to groups on the ground by being that overt, and just keep these things behind the scenes and it'll actually protect people on the ground. So I think if governments operate from a do no harm perspective, that's helpful. The other thing that I will say, not as a politician anymore, but as somebody who's part of an NGO and who works in this space in diversity and inclusion, is we have to get to the point where governments and political parties stop weaponizing LGBTQ2 rights. And we're not there in Canada yet. It's still a political football. I give my hats off to the United Kingdom, where it's not an issue across political parties to have LGBT representation in various parties. That's not the case. And in Canada, out of a chamber of 338 members of the House of Commons, only 4 are LGBT. 2 in the Liberals, 1 in the New Democrats, 1 in the Conservative Party, and 3 in the Senate out of 102. So we have a lot of work to do in our own backyard to get things going. And the final thing I'll say is be ready for that moment when something connects in a room that allows you to advance your agenda. And I'll give you a quick example. I was at a dinner, the Chilean government was there, the Canadian government. An ambassador made a comment to me that maybe we weren't going to be able to coordinate together on the Equal Rights Coalition, but if you go talk to that first secretary over there, maybe things could happen. I went and talked to the first secretary. She told me what the issue was. That afternoon, I talked to our foreign minister. The foreign minister talked to their foreign minister. An hour later, we had co-chairs from Chile. Sometimes it just moves that quickly, but you've got to be prepared to move and you've got to know what you want. And so thank you to everybody in this call. Reach out. I'd love to stay in touch. Steve, good luck to you on the move back. And I'm having a fabulous time here in Belfast. And thank you to Kenita and Jaevion and everybody. See you next time.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you. All right, Rhyesa, maybe we go with you and then Lysanne.
I think Randy gave some very excellent points. I think similar to our engagements on a national level, it's important that when governments engage other governments, that respecting the sovereignty of other states is very important. and that the kind of advocacy that they want to do does not come off as, like an imperial dictate, especially given our historical past, that you want to be sensitive to these realities, have an awareness of perhaps what the challenges are on the ground, because it may very well be that some government officials may want to implement certain policies, but the society is not there yet in terms of moving in that direction. So in trying to advocate for certain policies, it's important for us to be able to know where the society is and to try to promote organic growth. Because trying to push and jump when attitudes need to change, greater socialization, greater campaigning has to happen where we can bring the society where it needs to be. I think that is the focus for foreign governments when they try to negotiate. And I think tying conditionalities linked to aid, it sows bad blood. And what we really want to do is create partnerships for future engagements where we can all have a space where equity is a platform from which we can advocate from. So highlighting the point that we had mentioned earlier about awareness is very crucial. Sovereignty matters. Our historical relationships are also crucial. And engaging the institutions that are on the ground already speaking, fighting, trying to make inroads and seeing from their perspective what can be done to try to push forward that particular agenda rather than trying to bulldoze it to the society, because it isn't received well when that is done from that approach.
Thank you, Rhyesa. Lysanne?
Yes, I think actually all of the speakers before me said very, very clearly. And so I just think, like, I wanted to only reiterate that it's important for the government to listen to the organizations on the ground, to really seek engagement with them and to understand where they're coming from, where they're at, and why they have the vision for their movement, so to speak. And that also that where they can help, that they assist those organizations really and truly, and not try to dictate to those organizations what they see or what they think is the best route for them to go. Because something that may have worked in other areas of the world may not work in the area that they're currently trying to engage with. So I think that that's something that's super important. But also, so for example, in the case, I go back to St. Martin briefly, in the case where the kingdom is such a complex makeup of layers and whatnot, it's definitely important also for the government to listen to those organizations and saying that, listen, we want to do more than is being done right now. Because what has happened is that actually the government says, as it pertains to human rights and LGBT issues, we take a step back. But where it comes to like finance and your security, then we take a step. We take a step forward, and we want to actually have more insight or more jurisdiction over those areas. And so for us as LGBT organizations, we find that very ticklish, because we want more help. And then here you have the national government saying like, okay, no, we're taking hands off, when we're actually actively saying we need more funding, we need more resources. And then in areas where actually the civil service or civil society organizations are trying to say like, no, take your hands off. That's exactly where the national government would like to have, be more hands-on. So for me, I think it's super important to listen to the people, and also from a space of true equality, and that's where I like that Rhyesa said, understand our historical or our colonial legacy, and make space for the tough and sensitive conversations that have to happen in those spaces to really be at the table equally. So for me, I think that's where I will end it. But I think reiterating, listen to the organizations on the ground. They're the ones doing the work. They're the ones like really trying to mobilize communities and resources. So really listen to them and understand that they are also doing their best with what they have.
Thank you, Lysanne. So I have another question for Steve. So we've been talking a lot about foreign policy and why foreign policy is so very important to the work that we do in our countries to improve the human rights situation for different communities that we serve. And one of the things is that we know that someone like you, Steve, can't go out on your own and decide to do certain activities or take certain actions and decisions if it is contrary to foreign policy. So you might have been in the Caribbean for 10 years, you know, having served in Anguilla and then in St. Lucia. And so you have a fairly good understanding of what are the needs of the communities across the region. But the UK policies may not necessarily have caught up with the needs in that regard. And, you know, we have in the UK, for example, an organization like Kaleidoscope Trust, which works on UK foreign policy, and said, love, if from your perspective, you can share with us as advocates why it is important to engage an organization like Kaleidoscope Trust to really impact on foreign policy, so that at the end of the day, we benefit directly.
Sure, thanks for that question. It's a very, very good one, a very important one, I think. Groups like Kaleidoscope Trust have an awful lot of sway in the UK, actually. They do get listened to, and they also are very, very effective and efficient at sort of tapping different avenues of conversations, whether that's by using parliamentary routes, going through MPs' offices, going direct to ministerial offices like the FCO or the Home Office. So as you engage with them, you can be sure they're a very effective means of amplifying the issues that you want to get raised to decision makers in London who make foreign policy. And the other thing I would say on this, and this sprang to me just while some of the previous talkers were making a point about education. I'm better at my job here the more I know about St. Lucia and the Caribbean. And one of the best ways I can do that is by getting as pluralistic viewpoints, so talking to as many different types of people as possible and really listening. So asking where's the value of young people in foreign policy. The more I engage with foreign policy, the more I'm better at my job. I can reflect back to London what life is like in the Caribbean, what those issues genuinely are, and they can in turn then have a knock-on impact on the UK's foreign policy. So whether it's young people, LGBTQ rights, whether it's issues of race, whatever those issues are, you know, I'm better at my job the more sort of avenues of information I get, and I think that's a really important thing to consider. So I guess to summarize that, it's don't be afraid about trying all these different avenues, because the person approaching me is looking to get something out of it, looking to progress something, but also it's good for me too. So it's a very much a two-way exchange, I see it as, and we both get something out of it. And that applies equally for getting in touch with groups like Kaleidoscope Trust in the UK and other advocacy groups as well.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And the other thing, Steve, before you mute your mic, and if as an advocate, I want to know what the UK's foreign policy is, for example, what's the easiest way to figure that out?
Gosh, there's lots of different ways. There's an awful lot of UK policy on the gov.uk website. For example, you can pick up the parliamentary websites in the UK, and in particular, the committees, the parliamentary scrutiny committees in the UK government, and these are on the parliamentary website. These committees are set up, they do deep dives into UK policy. There's a foreign policy committee, you know, there's committees for pretty much any subject you can think of. And I'd really recommend people take a look at those as well. And then on a sort of more rolling day-to-day basis, I would encourage people to look, keep up to date with the FCDO's Facebook page, Twitter page. You will see policy, you know, as it is being rolled out. If you keep up with those digital media forums, I'd give a plug for the UK and Caribbean Facebook page, and also our various Twitter pages as well. And you'll see exactly what the UK is doing in the Caribbean.
Thank you, Steve. And Lysanne, so I know quite often as advocates in the region, we tend to focus a lot on the UK, and US, and to some extent Canada. But the Netherlands is also a huge player in human rights right across the world, especially when it comes to HIV and to women and girls and young people, for example. And so I'd love if you help us understand as advocates, what are some of the opportunities that are available to us as advocates in the region to engage the Dutch government and to engage organizations in the Netherlands, advocating to the Dutch government to do more globally.
Okay, yes, I'm on already. Okay, so first of all, indeed, the Netherlands is, especially for small island developing states, they're very big on contributing and whatnot. So I would say for organizations who are listening in, contact ECADE, because ECADE has a lot of information about that, about what the funding opportunities are, and how they can work together, because I think a lot of the times too, they're also interested in collaborative efforts. So contact ECADE, see which other islands are actually working on issues that are similar. And then with that, you can actually go to the Dutch government and try to get funding, particularly through foreign affairs. For me, again, I think it's about the sensitivity of what is possible within the region, because there are different segments of the region that can get funding. So, for example, the Eastern Caribbean islands can get a lot of funding, but within that constellation, the islands of the Dutch Caribbean cannot get that same funding. So for us, looking at opportunities has to often be beyond what the Netherlands can provide. But I will say, going back to your original question, there are a lot of opportunities through the Netherlands to get funding, in addition to the other organizations through, say Netherlands, especially if you're looking at LGBT rights and whatnot, but also through other organizations attached to the various ministries, and also through the ministries themselves. I would say definitely go to ECADE. ECADE is the expert on that, and contact Kenita Placid as our executive director to get that information. And to make use as much as possible for efforts that strengthen the region as a whole, because I think oftentimes we think that we're the only one doing the work on the ground, and actually we're stronger when we look and see who our partners can be in the region and how we can build programs that are more sustainable across countries. And I think also funders, in particular the Netherlands, is looking for that as well. So for me, I think that would sum up what I would say. I don't have specific information on exactly where funding is. Kenita would be more able to give directive along that lines. But what I would say is, because ECADE looks at how we can work together across the sub-region of the Eastern Caribbean, all ideas, all initiatives are things that we want to hear about as an organization. And so please, draft something. We have a template. If people are interested, reach out for the template. Draft something, tell us who the people are that you want to work with, and let's see how together we can actually move the region forward. And I was seeing something, I just want to touch on it because there's a conversation going on as well about organic growth, and not allowing not allowing organizations or things on the ground to just kind of happen in a laid back way as well. And I think I did want to touch on that just briefly about agenda setting, because I see even in the work around ECADE, sometimes we have our own ideas about what would work, and not just ECADE, so ECADE and Safe SXM, we have our own ideas about what would work, how it would best work in the region. And oftentimes we're met with some resistance from organizations and government officials who are in the global north, who envision things happening differently. And I just want to say that, we both have a responsibility to listen to each other. So on the ground, organizations have to develop at their own pace, but also not to be too laid back in their development, to really push and respond to the needs of their community. But also those persons that we're engaging with have to give room for us as organizations on the ground to really do our own work and do our own agenda setting. I think that's often, where it comes to funding, a very ticklish matter, but it's something that we have to really bring to the table time and time again, so that we actually do what's best for our communities at the end of the day.
Thank you, Lysanne. And we have a couple minutes left in the conversation, and I have two last questions here before I ask people to, give us some parting advice. So one of the things I think that's challenging for advocates, especially those who do not necessarily have a long-standing relationship with diplomatic missions, is the fact that there are many people who are engaged in the foreign service who work in cycles. And so, for some it's 4 years, for some it's 5 years. And so by the time you end up developing real good relationships with the diplomat, they're gone. And so I think it'd be good to hear what's some advice you have for advocates about building and maintaining relationships in spite of all of that. Let's go with you, Steve.
Thanks, Jaevion. Yeah, it's a very good point. For the UK, it's usually 3 or 4 year postings. Like myself, because I like the Caribbean so much, I've extended my postings. They've usually been 4.5 years. But it's a very good point. So just a couple of very practical things that is true for what we would call the British diplomats, but the country-based staff, such as my colleague and political officer, Aida Ali Hippolyte, who I think is on this call, is that she's from St. Lucia, so that relationship can last longer than just the extent of my posting. The second point I would just say is, as has been made several times on the call already, this is a marathon and not a sprint, and these sorts of big changes, which we all want to see, take an awful long time. However, that does not mean the engagement we have spent this time today talking about is not fruitful, because even though my face will change from the summer this year as the British representative in St. Lucia, the policy won't change, and the British government is entirely committed to issues of equality in the Caribbean and globally as well. So you can be sure that it's the plus point of saying I don't have the wiggle room to create British policy, is that it doesn't actually really, in a sense, matter if it's me or my successor, that there will be the same approach to work with ECADE, with all the groups represented here today, to try and make progress. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And then Rhyesa and Lysanne, I think over the last couple of years, I know that we have seen a number of people who have been activists in a former life, being senior diplomats, being posted in different countries, people who've worked with Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or may have started an organization in their country. And so I'd love to hear from you both very briefly what you think might be some of the advantages or benefits to advocates working in the region when there are people who would have worked as advocates in their former life being diplomats now. And we start with you, Rhyesa.
So I was saying that coming from a place where you are grounded in the realities of the region is an excellent vantage point to come from, because you know what kind of targeted assistance would be necessary, so that when you advocate from a position of awareness. But it's also important that you remember that all spaces you come into require that you adapt new skills and that you are aware and learning, because you're now into a space that may come with different complexities and challenges too, that are very different from the national or the local level. But I think coming from a position where you know what the realities are, it gives you a better vantage point to now say, I don't think that this policy in the way it is structured can work, but it can be adapted in this way to meet the conditions of the space that I am trying to speak from and to lobby for. Because very often, even in the example that you could have given before concerning the British government and engaging the Caribbean in terms of equity tied to conditionalities with resources, I think perhaps had someone on the British end engaged a representative locally, they would have known that perhaps there are other alternatives to the path that we want to get to, because we often think that there is only one road to get to a particular destination when there are multiple ways. And very often the kinds of change that we want to need to reflect some of the nuances that are present in different environments. So one might think that the best way to promote equity and change in the Caribbean has to come from a policy directive, whereas it might actually require maybe a cultural revolution, a change in thought that might need to be spurred from artists, cultural activists, persons who write and read, because these are the individuals who really drive social change and bring about the kind of revolution. So coming from that position of advocacy locally, you know that music plays a critical role in Caribbean development and society, and it often reflects value systems. So perhaps some of the areas that we can change can start with empowering these individuals to be part of the campaign or allyship to build greater representation for others, to facilitate greater equity. So I think that it is a positive move to have that background and going into the field. But I also too want us to be aware that even when we go into being diplomats on the international stage, that it too requires a retooling and other sets of engagement that are different from the national level.
Thank you, Rhyesa. Lysanne?
Yes, again, Rhyesa said a lot of what I wanted to say, and actually much more articulate than I am today. So, but I just want to say, I think it helps, with knowing what is happening on the ground, and so then that can also benefit where it comes to prioritizing policy development or policy implementation, and also the funding attached to that, because those persons will then know what sort of challenges they themselves face or organizations around them face, and can actually bring that knowledge then to developing new ways and of doing things for the islands. And again, then Rhyesa said, it's also important though to acknowledge that it's also an opportunity to, in the new polls, to learn things and also then pass that information on to the organizations on the ground or their network, letting them see where other avenues may have been that they did not see. So I think, I think, and especially I love the part where she spoke about actually the cultural revolution, because I think that's one of the things that that we don't do enough with in the Caribbean. And because I am an artist, and I think that, art for transformation is so impossible. I often think that it's not an area that we do enough with, or that even maybe some of our funders understand that we could do more with as a result. So I definitely liked her speaking about that approach.
Right, thank you, Lysanne. I think this has been a really, really wonderful discussion. I found it very useful, learned a lot, and I hope that for all of us, it has been very, very useful. Thank you so much to Steve, Randy, Lysanne, and Rhyesa. And now we turn over to Randall, who will bring the vote of thanks.
Again. It's my privilege to have been asked to deliver a vote of thanks for this occasion. On behalf of the Eastern Caribbean Alliance for Diversity and Equality, ECADE, I would like to say a huge thank you to our panelists, His Excellency Steve McCready, Randy Boissonnault, Lysanne Charles, and Rhyesa Joseph for taking time to be part of this session and speak on your work in diplomacy. To Kaleidoscope Trust for having the Commonwealth Equality Project, we extend a huge thank you for your cooperation in the organization of this event. To the moderator, Jaevion Nelson, for steering the session so skillfully and for being with ECADE throughout the week, providing a group of activists with the knowledge around diplomacy with a strategic diplomacy short course. Finally, I would like to thank the invited guests and all of you for being with us this morning. Last but not least, the ECADE team behind this panel discussion. Without your hard work in the background, this would not have been possible. Again, thank you all for being here and engaging with us to enlighten us as much as you can. Thank you.